Hey there, AP Environmental Science students. Ready to totally crush those quizzes and tests
We're here to help you dive deep.
into the world of environmental science and ace that AP exam.
That's right. We'll break down some key concepts,
Or
your intro materials, what even is environmental science.
then those four big ideas
You absolutely need to know.
and how the scientific method.
Really works in the real world.
All right, let's start with the basics. You're studying the environment, but have you ever stopped to think, what exactly is the environment?
It's a great question.
It seems so simple.
One that might seem obvious at first, but defining the environment is key to understanding everything else in this course. Think of it this way. The environment is basically everything around us that affects life.
Good.
That includes the air we breathe,
Yeah.
the water we drink, the soil beneath our feet, and all the living things from towering trees to tiny insects that share this planet with us.
Okay, that makes sense. But how is environmental science different from just appreciating nature or being an environmentalist?
That's where the scientific method comes in.
Right.
Environmental science is about using observation, data collection, and experiments to understand how human systems and natural systems interact. It's about finding evidence-based solutions to environmental problems.
So it's less about feelings and more about using data to make informed decisions.
Think of it like this. Protesting the removal of a park would be environmentalism, which is super important, but researching woodpecker populations in that park before making a decision, that's environmental science in action.
So it's less about gut feelings and more about using data to make informed decisions about the environment.
You got it. And that's a big part of what makes this course so challenging and rewarding. You're learning to think critically about the environment and use scientific evidence to understand the choices we make as a society.
Speaking of choices, I think it's safe to say humans have had a pretty massive impact on the planet. I mean, we've built cities, farmed vast landscapes, and even changed the climate.
You're absolutely right. Humans have a greater impact on the environment than any other species. We've converted land for our needs, and unfortunately, we've also caused the extinction of some species just by existing and expanding.
Oh no.
Remember those giant sloths and mammoths from your textbook? They're gone because of human activity.
That's a bit of a bummer. But it's not all doom and gloom, is it? We're also doing things to help the environment like restoring endangered species and protecting natural areas.
You're right, it's not all bad news. Humans have helped bring back animals like the giant panda from near extinction. And get this, the Great Plains of North America have actually expanded because of human activities. It's complicated. We have both positive and negative impacts on the environment.
Okay, so things are complex, which is why we need these big ideas
Hmm.
to help us make sense of it all. You mentioned these earlier, and they sound kind of like a cheat sheet for understanding environmental science.
They absolutely are. These four big ideas are the foundation of the entire AP Environmental Science course. They'll help you connect the dots between different topics and understand the big picture.
All right, I'm ready. Hit me with those big ideas.
All right, the first big idea is all about energy transfer. Think back to that power plant example.
Okay.
The total amount of energy stays the same, but it transforms into different forms: electricity, heat, light, and sound.
So it's not like energy is packed.
The second law of thermodynamics explains that as energy is transferred, some of it becomes less useful. Think about it. You can't capture all the heat and noise from a power plant and turn it back into electricity.
Okay, it's starting to click. Energy changes forms, but it doesn't just disappear. What's the next big idea?
The second one focuses on the interactions between Earth systems. You've got the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, all the water, the geosphere, the rocks and land, and the biosphere, all living things.
So many spheres.
These systems are interconnected. For example, pollution from a city can affect a nearby river. See how it's all connected?
Wow, yeah, it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
One change in a system can trigger a chain reaction in others.
Exactly. Now on to big idea number 3, interactions between different species and the environment. This is where we look at how living organisms interact with each other and their surroundings. We've already talked about how humans have had a big impact, but remember, life has been around for billions of years. We've only been around for a tiny fraction of that time, yet we're already changing things dramatically.
We're like the new kids on the block making a grand entrance, and maybe not always in the best way.
You could say that. And finally, big idea number 4 is all about sustainability.
Okay.
This one is huge, and you'll see it come up again and again throughout the course. It's about figuring out how to use resources in a way that doesn't completely mess things up for future generations. Can we meet our needs without depleting resources, polluting the environment, and basically making the planet uninhabitable? That's the challenge of sustainability.
Okay, so we've got energy systems, species, and sustainability, the four pillars of AP environmental science. It's starting to make more sense now how these big ideas tie everything together.
They're your guideposts for navigating the complexities of environmental science. Now that we've got a handle on these fundamental concepts, let's explore how scientists actually study the environment. Let's talk about the scientific method.
I know some people think the scientific method is just a boring set of steps you memorize for a test, but it's actually a dynamic process, right? Especially in environmental science, where you're dealing with real-world problems and messy systems.
You're absolutely right. In environmental science, the scientific method comes alive.
Okay, I'm ready to see how it works in action. Walk me through it.
It all starts with observation. Scientists notice something interesting in the environment. Maybe a decline in a fish population, a change in plant growth, or unusual weather patterns. Then they use their existing knowledge and research to form a hypothesis.
So they see something weird and...
A hypothesis is essentially a testable explanation for what they're observing.
So it's like a detective looking for clues and forming a theory about who committed the crime.
Exactly. Now, to test their hypothesis, scientists design experiments. Let's say they're trying to figure out if a new fertilizer is harming a local pond. They might set up an experiment with two groups of ponds, one group exposed to the fertilizer and a control group that isn't. By comparing the two groups, they can isolate the effects of the fertilizer and see if it really is the culprit.
So they're trying to create a controlled environment to pinpoint the cause and effect.
You got it. But here's the thing. Environmental science often involves studying huge, complex systems with tons of interacting variables. It's not always possible to control every factor in a lab setting.
Right, so what about a giant forest or something?
That's where natural experiments come in. Imagine an oil spill, for example. That's a tragic event, but it also presents a unique opportunity for scientists to study how ecosystems respond to a sudden, dramatic change. They can observe how different species are affected, how the oil spreads, and how long it takes for the environment to recover.
So they're using these real-world events as a way to learn about environmental processes.
Exactly. And one more crucial point. A single study is rarely enough to draw definitive conclusions. Scientific knowledge is built on multiple studies, repeated observations, and what's called peer review. This means other scientists scrutinize the methods and results to ensure they're valid and reliable.
So it's like a constant process of testing, refining, and verifying.
That's the beauty of science. It's a collaborative effort to understand the world around us, and it's constantly evolving as we gather more evidence.
This is making me think about all the environmental problems we're facing today. Climate change, pollution, deforestation, these are huge, complex issues. How can we even begin to address them?
That's where those big ideas come back into play. They provide the framework for understanding these issues and finding solutions. And speaking of solutions, in the next part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring how these big ideas connect to real-world environmental problems. So stay tuned.
Welcome back, environmental explorers. In part one, we laid the groundwork.
Defining environmental science.
And exploring those
4 big ideas.
that are key to acing this course.
And those big ideas aren't just abstract concepts. They're the tools you'll use to understand real-world environmental challenges and potential solutions.
Okay, I'm ready to see how they apply. Let's revisit those big ideas one by one and connect them to the stuff we're learning in class.
Sounds good. We started with energy transfer. Remember, it's all about how energy changes forms but can't be created or destroyed. Think about how this applies to something like food webs.
Okay.
You know how energy flows from producers like plants to consumers like herbivores and then to carnivores? Each time energy is transferred up the food chain, some of it is lost as heat. That's the second law of thermodynamics in action.
Right, and that's why there are usually fewer predators at the top of the food chain. There's just not enough energy to support a huge population of, say, tigers or sharks.
Exactly. And energy transfer is also a big deal when we talk about renewable energy sources like solar and wind power. We're trying to capture energy from the sun and wind and convert it into usable forms like electricity.
So understanding energy transfer helps us evaluate the efficiency of different energy sources and their environmental impacts. Pretty cool. Okay, what about the next big idea interactions between Earth's systems? How does that play out in the real world?
Think about climate change. You're probably learning about this in class, right? It's a perfect example of how Earth systems, the atmosphere, oceans, land, and ice are all interconnected.
Right.
When we burn fossil fuels, we release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Mm,
These gases trap heat, leading to rising global temperatures, but it doesn't stop there.
right. The warming atmosphere melts glaciers and ice caps, which raises sea levels.
Yeah.
And then you've got changes in weather patterns, more extreme storms, and impacts on ecosystems all over the planet.
Exactly. It's a chain reaction,
Hmm.
and it shows how one change in a system can have cascading effects throughout the entire planet.
Whoa. Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about all the ways these systems are linked. Okay, on to big idea number 3, interactions between different species and the environment. We know humans have had a huge impact on biodiversity, but I'm curious to learn more about how other species interact and influence their ecosystems.
Think about keystone species. These are species that have a disproportionately large impact on their environment relative to their abundance. A good example is the sea otter. Sea otters love to eat sea urchins, and sea urchins love to munch on kelp forests.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them.
Now, when sea otter populations decline, sea urchin numbers explode, and they can decimate entire kelp forests.
Wow, so the sea otter is like the guardian of the kelp forest. If it disappears, the whole ecosystem collapses.
Exactly. And then you have invasive species. These are organisms that aren't native to a particular ecosystem and can cause a lot of harm.
I see.
They often outcompete native species for resources, disrupt food webs, and can even introduce diseases.
Like those Burmese pythons that are taking over the Everglades in Florida. I read about those.
That's a prime example. Invasive species are a major threat to biodiversity worldwide, and understanding their impacts is a big part of environmental science.
This is fascinating stuff. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about sustainability. It seems like this concept is everywhere these days, but what does it really mean in the context of AP environmental science?
Sustainability is about finding ways to meet our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's about using resources responsibly, reducing our impact on the environment, and protecting the planet for the long haul.
But that sounds like a huge GE challenge, especially with all the environmental problems we're facing. Where do we even begin?
It does seem daunting, but there are so many things we can do both individually and as a society. We can reduce our consumption, conserve energy and water, support sustainable agriculture, invest in renewable energy sources, and protect natural habitats. It's about making conscious choices in our daily lives and advocating for change on a larger scale.
So it's a combination of personal responsibility and systemic change.
Exactly, and that's why AP Environmental Science is so relevant. It's not just about learning facts, it's about empowering you to understand complex environmental issues and become part of the solution.
Wow. I'm starting to see how these big ideas connect to all sorts of real-world problems and potential solutions. This is making me think about my own role in creating a more sustainable future.
And that's exactly what we want you to do. Think critically, ask questions, and explore the ways you can make a difference. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts to ponder, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to the final part of our AP Environmental Science Deep Dive. We've come a long way,
Exploring the fundamentals.
and those
Big ideas.
that tie everything together.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But
By the puzzle we need to explore.
those scientists actually do environmental science.
Right, because it's one thing to talk about like energy transfer and sustainability, but it's another thing to see how those ideas are applied in real-world research.
Exactly. Remember the scientific method?
Yeah.
It's the foundation of all scientific inquiry, and it's especially crucial in environmental science, where we're dealing with complex systems and pressing problems.
Okay, let's break it down. Remind me again how the scientific method works in the context of environmental science.
It all starts with observation. Scientists are naturally curious, and they're always observing the world around them. They might notice changes in animal populations, patterns of pollution in a river, or the effects of deforestation on a particular ecosystem.
So they're like detectives looking for clues in the environment.
That's a great analogy. And once they've made these observations, they start to ask questions and formulate hypotheses. A hypothesis is essentially a testable explanation for what they're seeing.
Okay, so they have a hunch about what might be going on, but how do they actually test their hypothesis?
That's where experimental design comes in. Scientists carefully design experiments to isolate variables and test the effects of different factors. Sometimes they can conduct controlled experiments in a lab setting.
For instance, they might study the effects of different pollutants on plant growth in a controlled environment.
That makes sense. But I imagine it's not always possible to control every variable, especially when you're dealing with large-scale environmental issues.
You're absolutely right. In many cases, environmental scientists have to rely on natural experiments.
Hmm.
This means they observe the effects of events that happen naturally, like volcanic eruptions, oil spills, or even changes in weather patterns.
So they're using these real-world events as opportunities to study how ecosystems respond to different pressures.
Exactly. It's like nature is conducting the experiment, and scientists are carefully observing and collecting data to understand what's happening. And it's important to remember that one study is rarely enough to draw definitive conclusions.
So what happens next? How do scientists build on these initial studies?
Well, they share their findings with the scientific community through publications and presentations. And other scientists scrutinize their methods, analyze their data, and often try to replicate their results. This process of peer review is essential to ensure the quality and reliability of scientific knowledge.
So it's like a constant process of testing, refining, and verifying information.
That's the heart of science. It's a collaborative effort, and it's constantly evolving as we gather more evidence. And over time, as hypotheses are repeatedly tested and supported by evidence, they can become scientific theories or even laws.
Like the laws of thermodynamics we talked
Yeah,
about earlier. They
exactly.
started as hypotheses were rigorously tested, and now they're considered like fundamental principles of physics.
Exactly. So as you progress through your AP Environmental Science course, remember that you're not just memorizing facts, you're learning to think like a scientist. You're learning to question, to observe, to analyze, and to use evidence to draw conclusions about the world around us.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
We've explored the foundations of environmental science, those four key big ideas, and the process of scientific inquiry. I feel like I have a much better grasp of this subject now.
And remember, this is just the beginning of your journey into the fascinating world of environmental science. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more ways to apply your knowledge to make a positive impact.
To all of our AP environmental science students out there, we want to leave you with this thought. You are the future stewards of this planet. The knowledge and skills you're gaining in this course will empower you to understand and address the environmental challenges we face.
So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep pushing for a more sustainable future. That's what environmental science is all about.
And that concludes our AP Environmental Science Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and feel inspired to continue exploring this crucial and fascinating subject. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.